Hey there, I'm Dr. Jessica, and let's talk about some natural approaches to dealing with symptoms of anxiety. Let's dive in. So, in dealing with my patients who are chronically stressed, recovering from burnout, on their way to burnout, one of the common symptoms I often see are feelings of anxiety or feeling anxious and restless. And of course, there are a multitude of ways to approach this. Anything from traditional cognitive behavioral therapy to prescriptions and medications. But there is a lot of leeway in between in which I use a more natural approach. And one of the main ways I generally do this is looking at lifestyle and also looking at nutrition. One of the things in working with nutrition is that I will often start to look at gut health and looking at the microbiome, looking for any signs of dysbiosis or any other kind of GI related issue. And the reason I often do this is that we're learning more and more about the gut microbiome and how it talks to the brain and how the microbiome and the gut itself is often responsible for producing neurotransmitters as well. And this can affect our mood, it can affect feelings of anxiety and even feelings of depression as well. So, looking at your gut health and looking at your nutrition is a great way to often approach this. In a lot of cases, I will use different types of functional tests, so such as stool testing. I'll leave a link to a video where I talk about stool testing and the uses that can come from that. But I will often do this because it helps me better understand that person's microbiome and what's going on with their digestion, and can give me an overall peek into their gut health. And from there, I'm often able to determine if we need to correct the imbalance in the microbiome, if we need to work on, neurotransmitters, etc., etc. So that's really one way to start. It's also important to look at nutrition because a lot of times we need to make sure that our diet is including enough of the precursors to help make some of our neurotransmitters as well. So if we're not having a balanced diet and if we're not maybe getting enough of those precursors, or if there's an issue in our pathway somewhere, that can be a reason for some of the symptoms of anxiety or increasing feelings of anxiety, especially when there's chronic stress, because we know that chronic stress can affect our GI system, often disrupting the balance or even causing things like leaky gut. Another area I often focus on is looking at exercise, and more specifically types of exercise, or working with the client to figure out the type of exercise that's going to be best for them. Often I'm actually taking away things like high intensity interval training, or at least modifying it to make sure there's enough recovery time in between. Now, there's nothing wrong with high intensity interval training. Do not come for me in the comments. However, if a person is already experiencing high levels of stress and higher levels of anxiety, too much HIIT can actually make those feelings worse. And that is because high intensity interval training does increase cortisol, and it can often keep that cortisol elevated, making those symptoms worse. Now, exercise overall can actually kind of increase cortisol for a brief period, but when we look at things like resistance training, there's actually more research coming out saying that even though in the short term, things like resistance training may spike cortisol as we're doing the exercise, we actually see longer term benefits in a reduction of that cortisol and a reduction in the symptoms of things like anxiety when we have a regular resistance practice. So really starting to dial in the type of exercise a person is doing, or getting them to exercise at all, is often a really key factor in working with that natural approach to dealing with symptoms of anxiety. And of course, another approach that I often take is looking at mindset and looking specifically at mindfulness. I will leave a link to a previous video that I did that talked about the effects of mindfulness, stress-based reduction techniques, often things like meditation, yoga, breath work. There was a study that showed they were just as effective as escitalopram, or another medication often prescribed for anxiety. And I'll leave a link to that video down in the description box as well. And again, it's not a one-size-fit-all approach for everybody. Sometimes medications are helpful. I'm not saying not to take your medication, or that it's wrong to take medication. But if you're looking for another approach, I want to educate you that there are options out there. In working with mindset and working with specifically with meditation, what we are actually doing, we're actually helping to change our brainwave patterns. So when we're anxious and we're feeling kind of, overwhelmed and excited, we're often in what we call like a high beta brainwave pattern. What we want to do, or what helps to trigger our parasympathetic nervous system, is actually slipping into states like alpha, brainwave patterns and even theta and sometimes even delta when you're in a deep meditation. This kind of gets us out of that sympathetic mode. It gets us out of producing a lot of adrenaline and epinephrine and a lot of cortisol and switches on that rest and digest or relax nervous system mode. So we're kind of putting the brake on our sympathetic nervous system and pushing more into our parasympathetic nervous system. That is generally associated with, feeling less anxious or having less anxious thoughts, having less worry kind of going on in our head. Working with your gut health and your nutrition, working with your exercise, tweaking your exercise, making sure you're doing the right type of exercise, and also looking at your mindset and looking at mindfulness practices can really be a great way to naturally approach symptoms of anxiety, especially when they're caused or due to stress and overwhelm. So I hope that this video was helpful. If you have questions, as always, leave them down below. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Bye.